In honor of Memorial Day, let's talk about Leander Herron. As legend would have it, he would rather fight than eat, and this young wild roughneck was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his valor while serving on the western frontier while defending the Santa Fe Trail in the late 1800s. Welcome to Liberty Street, where we walk through history to tell the story of Pennsylvania crude and uncover stories of the men and women of the oil region. Today we travel to 1868, when America was still a young country, sending its young and faithful into the Wild West. You will hear Lee Herron recall his encounter with the Plains Indians, the reported enemy at that time. Yes, the battles with the Plains Indians is a dark spot on American history, and it is of sensitive nature. I present historic news as it was reported, and then I relate it to current events, so this topic may not be of interest to you today. My story today is not so much about the conflict, but of a young man and his fighting spirit. All right, let's talk about Lee Herron. His lifetime service to his country began in Canal Township, Venango County, where at the age of 16 he joined the 83rd Pennsylvania Infantry. He lived his young life with his family at Waterloo on French Creek, and he spent his youth traveling the waterways on a packet boat. Now, according to his father, he was a born fighter, so it made sense that he was anxious to enlist after the attack on Fort Sumter. He lied about his age and joined the Union Army on December 7, 1863, and he eventually found his way to Virginia in 1864. And here he is pictured standing near General Grant and General Meade. He was part of Burnside's 2nd Virginia campaign and involved in the Mud March of January 1863. He was also in Gettysburg and the Petersburg campaigns. Herron stated that he was discharged from the Civil War on June 28, 1865, while standing in a field in northern Virginia. He made his way home to northwest Pennsylvania, where he worked in the oil industry as a roughneck at Pit Hole City. While he was not a key player in Standard Oil's monopoly, he did pass go a time or two. And after the oil boom, while Rockefeller and the others chose a life on Wall Street, Herron's wild spirit led him to the frontier and running with the likes of Kit Carson, Wild Bill Hickok, Deadwood Dick, and Buffalo Bill. This man has quite a story to tell, and in this series we will be taking a look at his life as a raftsman on the Pennsylvania waterways, oil roughneck, Civil War soldier, Pony Express rider on the Santa Fe Trail, and his time spent in Nebraska and the Russian oil fields. As I studied this man, I could clearly see that Lee Herron had a tendency to be the right man in the right place at the right time, and he lived during one of the most thrilling times in American history. His story begins today at Fort Dodge, Kansas. Herron had re-enlisted into the service and was attached to Custer's 7th U.S. Cavalry. He was a scout. He knew Custer well and was often at the front during Custer's command. In October of 1866, he took part in the rescue of the Fox family, and he rode into the Indian encampment and negotiated for the safe return of 2 little girls. After which he was promoted to corporal and attached to the 3rd United States Infantry. Now, according to Herron, at that time, the natives were restless on the Santa Fe Trail, and it was, in his words, a battleground between Fort Harker and Fort Lyon. He said the tribes were made up of Comanches, Cheyennes, Apaches, and Dog soldiers, and they were banding together to run the settlers out of Kansas, and they were trying to stop supplies. By the summer of 1868, they had stopped the Anderson stagecoaches from running between Leavenworth and Santa Fe. And the natives were numerous. They outnumbered the soldier, but they lacked gunpowder, so they were still relying on their bows and arrows. Since the stage lines were abandoned, a governmental pony express was put in service in Kansas. Riding was done at night and with a partner. On September 21st, 1868, Herron left Fort Larned with mail and official military dispatch. And while riding, he came upon a government supply wagon with a few men. He warned them do not continue into the dangerous territory, that things were heating up on the trail, and asked them to turn around and go back. And then he continued on with his ride. After reaching Fort Dodge the next day, he saw smoke signals, and he knew it meant trouble. He was ordered to ride at sundown back to Fort Larned with more dispatches, and he was ordered to select another scout to ride with him. Instead of picking Wild Bill, he chose Paddy O'Boyle of the 7th Cavalry to ride with him, because Paddy had the best horse. Herron recounted that they rode in the dark in silence until they heard a gunshot, and then another, and then a distant yell. They changed their official course and rode into the direction of the sounds, and they saw flashes off the rounds near a wagon under attack. They rode right into the band of Indians and right through them, yelling, and he made his way to the wagon, and Herron discovered it was the same party of men he had seen the day before. At the same time that he realized who the men were, the natives started another charge, and according to Herron, they fought all night long. And by his accounts, the men and soldiers were outnumbered by 50 to 75 natives. In the darkness, and while still under attack, Paddy O'Boyle snuck away to get help, and Lee remained. And knowing that they were circled, their only defense was to try to move the wagon slowly over a deep rut or hole so that they could jump under the wagon and stand in the well for cover. And since they were almost out of ammunition, they did not think that they could survive the night. So they made a pact to fight until each man had just one bullet left in their Remington revolver. Although they were injured and hurting bad, a cavalryman named Jimmy Goodman had been wounded 7 times by arrows, and Private Jack O'Donnell had been struck in the head with a tomahawk. The other man, Nolan, was wounded by both bullets and arrows. As it neared midnight, he could hear the natives approaching on their final charge. Herron could clearly see that they had divided themselves and were going to attack from 2 sides or 2 directions. But only one division charged. Unbeknownst to Herron, Paddy, and he made it out to the nearby fort. He returned with the infantry, and since the soldiers were startled at night and awakened in their sleep by Paddy, they jumped up, ran to their horses to race to Lee's rescue, but they were still dressed in their underwear and their nightshirts. So they rode into battle in their nightclothes on horseback. And the superstitious natives mistook the soldiers dressed in white riding in the moonlight as ghosts, and they suddenly retreated. And the battle was recorded as Little Coon Creek, and for his act of heroism, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he tells his story in this recording from 1930.
Thank you, Captain Rickenbacker. Back in the 60s, Fort Dodge, Kansas, was a distributing point for supplies along the Santa Fe Trail. We were fighting with the Indians all the time, and my hardest scrap with them took place near Fort Dodge in September 1868. That was 62 years ago, but I remember it as clearly as if it had happened but yesterday. One evening, the commanding officer at Fort Dodge ordered me to choose a convoy and carry dispatches to Fort Larned, 75 miles away. I was a young fellow then, and I felt honored by the assignment. Because such well-known scouts as Wild Bill Hickok, California Joe, and Apache Bill were at the fort and might have been chosen. We could see the Indians signaling with smoke and fire on the hilltops in all directions, and that meant trouble. So I picked Paddy Boyle, a tried and true friend, and a brave man to come along with me. We managed to sneak out of the fort and were well on our way when up near Little Coon Creek we heard rifle fire and the blood-curdling yells of the Indians. We swung away from the trail, and there, huddled in a ravine, were 4 men and a mule team. The crack and flash of rifles around the edge of the ravine showed that the Indians had been in a pocket. We were on an important mission. Our orders were to proceed to Fort Lynders with all possible speed, but I just couldn't see those white men massacred. So we spurred our horses and cut through the circle of Indians and joined the little group in the ravine. I sent Boyle, who had the best horse, back to the fort for help. The brave fellow plunged down the ravine, which opened out on the plains, and although it was night, the Indians somehow saw him and went trooping after him. We assumed he had been killed, and we decided to sell our lives at the highest possible cost. The Indians kept rushing us on their horses, hanging on the far side of the mount, so that we had only a leg and an arm to shoot us. Soon we began to suffer casualties. One of our men was tomahawked in a hand-to-hand combat with a husky brave. Bullets and arrows disabled the others, so that 2 of us had to bear the brunt of the defense. Then our ammunition began to run low. The Indians were making smaller and smaller circles around us, and it looked like the end had arrived. And just as they seemed to be preparing for the final rush, a body of horsemen in white appeared. At first, we thought they were Indians in disguise, but they called out in English, and when the leader galloped up, it was Boyle, at the head of a squadron from the 7th United States Cavalry.
Why the white uniforms, Corporal Herron?
It wasn't uniform, Captain. The garrison of the fort had been asleep when Boyle arrived, and they jumped from their bunks and rushed to our rescue in their night shirts and underwear. Strange to say, I came through without a scratch. I didn't count the number of times the wagon was struck, but those who did told me that it was hit 500 times with bullets and arrows, and those arrows were sticking out like quills on a porcupine.
Herron's commitment to the United States did not end after the battle at Little Coon Creek. In 1874, he returned in a civilian capacity and was located at Fort Hartsuff, Nebraska, where he was employed as an engineer to build the fort. He operated the steam-powered sawmill, and all the lumber and shingles used in this fort were sawed by him. In 1926, he returned to the fort for a dedication and left a pencil-written message on the wall of the barracks mess hall. On November 11, 1921, Herron was recognized again by the United States government. He stood atop a hill overlooking Washington, D.C., near a white marble tomb. He was invited by the president to be an honorary pallbearer from Nebraska, the final resting place for one of America's unidentified World War I service members, at the burial site of the unknown soldier in Arlington Cemetery. Herron lived most of his adult life in Nebraska, and as he was nearing the end of his life, he wrote a letter home to Pennsylvania. On November 21, 1927, his reflections in part go something like this. My wife and I were early settlers of Venango County, and I speak of the strange mysteries of the life long since. I was there when Drake struck oil, the first well on Oil Creek, the Lovell family who lived there, and many hundred others who were prime movers in those strange, wild days of oil. I hold a Congressional Medal of Valor in Nebraska. I served in the Civil War and I was a operator, driller, contractor on Oil Creek for years. I'm going to ask a favor of you. I have a longing for Venango County chestnuts, like we used to gather in the woods some 70 years ago. Won't you, when you're downtown at some store, pick up 3 or 4 pounds and ship to me? And should you see some Rambo apples, why, a couple pounds of them will do. I am yours, a very old man, Lee Herron. This fall, we will revisit this man's request for Rambo apples when we approach the annual Apple Fest celebration the first weekend in October in the city of Franklin. And I will tell you the story of Johnny Appleseed, too.